Welcome to the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good, former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. The title of this podcast is The Constitutional Powers of the Federal Government. The Constitutional Powers of the Federal Government. Before we begin, I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, share it with your friends, and follow me on social media at Rep. Bob Good. The constitutional powers of the federal government. Most, if not all, of our problems related to the federal government are a result of a failure to adhere to our constitutional principles, our founding principles, the Constitution itself. Again, most, if not all, of our problems related to our federal government are the result of a failure to adhere to our Constitution and our founding principles and the limited powers of the federal government in the Constitution. So whether you're talking about the crippling, crushing $38 trillion in debt under which we are suffering today and the $2 trillion annual deficit, most of that spending, most of that debt was incurred by not adhering to the limits of the Constitution on the federal government. So whether you're talking about our debt or the expansion of the federal government generally, where the government's doing so many things it's not constitutionally empowered to do, and the resulting reduced freedom that we as a people are suffering, all of this reflects the failures of our federal government to operate within the limits, specifically limited in the Constitution. Our founders, 250 years ago, sought divine intervention. They sought God's help. And they believed that the establishment of our constitutional republic, this first experiment on this planet in self-rule, where people would select and create their own government. The founders, again, sought divine intervention. They sought help from the Lord in doing that, and they believed that establishing this country, crafting this Constitution, was nothing short of a miracle. The Constitution itself, humanly speaking, was brilliant. It was revolutionary. It was ingenious with its separation of powers, checks and balances on the government, etc. The balance of power between the states and the federal government. The ability of the three branches of the federal government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, to check and balance the power of one another. Ronald Reagan, some 25 or some 45 or so years ago, talked about how we were unique among the nations of the world in that our Constitution, our founding document, our highest law of the land, serves to limit what government can do instead of what we the people can do. In his farewell address, he famously stated, quote, "Almost all of the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do. We, the people, are free." Let me read that again. This is from Ronald Reagan in his farewell address when he was leaving in January of 1989 after serving 8 years as president. Ronald Reagan said, quote, "Almost all the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do. We, the people, are free." Unfortunately, not enough Americans are aware of this or sufficiently care about this. And most Americans are not, therefore, working to keep the republic to which we've been entrusted. And as a result, we are saddled with or burdened by politicians and elected officials who don't know or don't care or don't know to care about the constitutional limits of the government, particularly the federal government. States and local governments are prohibited from breaking federal law, violating the Constitution, or infringing on our constitutionally protected rights and freedoms, which are innumerable. Let me say it again. States and local governments are prohibited from breaking federal law. Federal law usurps state or local law. States and local governments are prohibited from violating the Constitution. Like you can't have your city or your community, your town or your state pass a law, eliminating the Second Amendment within its borders. State and local governments are prohibited from breaking federal law, violating the Constitution, or infringing on our constitutionally protected rights and freedoms, which, as we will discuss as we go along, are innumerable. We have innumerable constitutionally protected rights and freedoms in this country. The federal government, on the other hand, has very specific constitutional powers and limits. States and local governments don't have very specific constitutional powers and limits. There's a lot of discretion and latitude given to state and federal governments. Again, they can't break federal law. They can't violate the Constitution. They cannot strip away our constitutional freedoms and rights. But the federal government, on the other hand, has very specific and limited constitutional powers and limits to its authority. In fact, our Constitution begins what is called the preamble, the introduction, the opening paragraph of the Constitution by stating, "We the people." It starts with, "We the people." Our Constitution doesn't say, "We the government," or "the government." It says, "We the people." It's emphasizing, clarifying, and prioritizing where or from whom our government, or any legitimate government for that matter, gets its power. So beginning the preamble to the Constitution with "We the people" emphasizes, clarifies, and prioritizes where our government or any legitimate government gets its power from the people. That power originates, as it is written in the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence, of course, came before the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence was the document that was making the case as to why there would be a revolution, why we should be free. And the Declaration of Independence said that the government gets its power from the consent of the governed. Again, the government gets its power from the consent of the governor, from the consent of the people. Again, that is the only thing that gives government its legitimacy, because it gets its power from the people. Government power that is not supported by the people is illegitimate power. Government power that is not supported by the people is illegitimate power. Unfortunately, or sadly, tragically, most of the world today, and down throughout most of human history, most of the world today suffers under illegitimate government power because they're not getting their power from the consent of the people. And throughout history, that's been the case for the vast majority of people, of course. They have lived and suffered under illegitimate power, illegitimate government power that did not get its power from the consent of the governed or from the consent of the people. So this was revolutionary, truly revolutionary, when this government was established by the people, of the people, for the people, getting its power from the consent of the government, where the people chose their form of government. The people chose a republic. The people chose a constitutional republic, and we are still the beneficiaries of that some 250 years ago today. So the preamble to the Constitution, again, the opening paragraph, the introduction, goes on to state the purpose for which the American government was created and established, that we the people, we established this government. Why? It tells us, it gives 6 reasons in the preamble or opening of the Constitution. It says, to form a more perfect union, not a perfect union. It couldn't be a perfect union because the country was going to be made up of people and leaders who were imperfect just like us. But it said, for the purpose, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice. Without justice, you don't have anything. We've been talking about that a lot in our country the last couple of years. If you don't have everyone equal under the law, if you don't have equal treatment under the law, if everybody's not held accountable to the same standards under the law, if you don't have justice, you really don't have anything. So to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility. That means a peaceful society. Again, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. That is the primary purpose of the federal government, to provide for the common defense, to keep us safe from foreign adversaries, from invasion, and also to defend our constitutional freedoms. So again, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. That means the whole nation. Promote the general welfare. General means the whole nation, not just special interests, not just certain states, not just blue cities or big cities, but promote the general welfare. That negates most government spending today, most earmarks, things that are targeted towards certain groups or certain localities, certain states, certain projects, but don't benefit the entire country. So, and also it said promote the general welfare. It didn't say facilitate. It didn't say guarantee. It didn't say guarantee the general welfare or guarantee it. It said promote it, meaning facilitate it, provide an opportunity, permit human flourishing by creating a climate or environment that allows that to happen. So again, what's the purpose? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, those that come after us. So that's talking about the purpose, again, was to form the more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That means freedom generally, unbridled rights to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, keeping the republic. So the purpose of the Constitution, the purpose of forming this government was these things specifically. And so the Constitution built upon the principles of the preceding Declaration of Independence. And it was the Declaration of Independence, again, that came first, that made the case, hey, why should we be free from the British crown, free from the King of England? And what was the case for establishing this new republic? And the Declaration made that case before the Constitution, where based on the concept of self-evident truths, that there are certain truths that we all know because God created us and put these within our hearts. Self-evident truths that we're all created equal, that we have unalienable rights that come from our Creator, that we've got rights that are by virtue of being born, being created, being a human being, that government exists to secure, ensure, protect those rights only. That government exists to secure, ensure, protect those rights only, as said in the Declaration of Independence, and only with the power granted by the consent of the people for these purposes. So again, the case that was made for the Declaration of Independence, why we should establish a new country, was that there's self-evident truths that we're all created equal, that we have unalienable rights coming from our Creator, and that government exists to secure, ensure, protect those rights only with the power that's granted by the consent of the people for these purposes. So the people give the government its power to do the things the people give the government power to do. So the Constitution, of course, goes much further than the Declaration of Independence and actually lists the limited and specific powers granted particularly to the federal government, the central government. The founders were very concerned about an oppressive, all-consuming, all-controlling central government. And so they specifically gave the federal government limited specific powers in the Constitution. Everything else was or is to be left to the people and the states. So everything other than the powers specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution were to be left to the people, us as individuals, and the states, our local and state government. Most of the specific and limited powers that were given to the federal government in the Constitution were given specifically to the legislative branch, to the Congress, to the House and the Senate. Again, most of the specific and limited powers that were given to the federal government in the Constitution were directed to the legislative branch, the House and the Senate, the Congress. The people's branch, the legislative branch, was intended by the founders to be the dominant and most powerful branch of government. The founders wanted the most powerful branch, specifically the House of Representatives, to have the shortest terms, only 2 years. That way they would have to answer most often, most frequently to the people, and they'd be most accountable to the voters. So they gave the most important responsibilities of the federal government specifically to the House. And specifically that included taking and spending our money. He who he who has the gold makes the rules, the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. Well, if you give the House the gold is the House is essentially making the rules. So the the founders gave specifically the House the power of taking our money, taxing us, and spending our money. The founders also knew that it was a very important power, the ability to declare war, to send our sons into war, and to assemble armies for that purpose. So they gave that power to the House. The Constitution doesn't state or even infer three co-equal branches of government. That's not really constitutional. Again, the founders intended that the legislative branch, the Congress, would be the most powerful, most dominant branch of government. And while critical abilities were provided in the Constitution to empower the branches to check and limit one another, there's powers given to the executive branch of the president to limit the Congress or the judicial branch, the same for the judicial branch to limit the executive branch and the legislative, and then vice versa, the legislative branch to limit the judicial and the executive branches. The founders, however, devoted far more space in the Constitution, and they started the Constitution with Article 1 to describe and give the powers to the legislative branch. So in other words, they gave more space in the Constitution. The bulk of the Constitution deals with the Congress, the legislative branch, the people's branch. It came first in Article 1 and gave most of the power to the Congress. The reason that's so important is because for us to recognize and to realize is because we have very little control over the judicial branch. We have very little control over judges who are serving for a lifetime. We have much less control over a president who's only elected every 4 years, who is one person leading the entire 330 or 40 million people in the country. But we have much more access and influence over our House representative, particularly our Senate as well, but particularly the House. So the founders wanted the branch that was closest and most responsive to the people to have the majority of the power. That it would be the House that would have local districts, would have local offices in those districts, and would serve only 2-year terms so they could be held most accountable by the people. So the House and the Congress more broadly can do anything at once except violate the Constitution. And again, it can't violate the Constitution by doing things that empower the federal government to do that which the Constitution doesn't empower the federal government to do. But the House has the ability, the Congress, the House and the Senate, to make the laws and even to change the Constitution. The founders wisely enabled the ability to change the Constitution, but they made it difficult with supermajorities of the Congress, both houses, supermajorities of the states, and that's why it's only happened 27 times. There's only been 27 amendments to the Constitution. So Congress can do just about anything at once that doesn't violate the Constitution because it can make the federal laws and even change the Constitution, although it's very difficult to do. But the Congress controls the money. That's a critically important power of the federal government, and can override the president by a veto when the president, tries to, can override the president, a presidential veto. When the president vetoes a law, the Congress can override that with a supermajority. The Congress can even remove the president or members of his cabinet through impeachment. The Congress determines the jurisdiction of the judicial branch. So the Constitution actually says that the Congress can limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and tell the Supreme Court, hey, you don't have jurisdiction over this area or that area. And of course, the Congress can also impeach and remove judges or members of the judicial branch. But even though the Constitution intended, the founders intended, that the Congress, the House and the Senate would be the most dominant powers legislative branch, Congress was specifically tasked with the duty and responsibility to do only certain things, only a couple of dozen things. We're going to run through those things. So while Congress was to be the most dominant, most powerful branch of the federal government, even Congress is only given the Constitution very specific, limited powers. Now, they're great powers, but they were given the power, here we'll run through those, to tax us, to spend our money, and when necessary, to borrow. That is a role of Congress. To establish rules for citizenship, to establish bankruptcy laws, to coin and regulate the value of money, to standardize weights and measurements, to punish counterfeits, to set the time, place, and manner of elections, to set the rules of the legislative bodies, meaning Congress makes the rules for the House and for the Senate, to regulate commerce or trade, to establish a postal system, to post roads, think interstates and highways, to pass copyright and patent laws, protecting writers and inventors and so forth, to establish federal courts, to punish crimes on the high seas, which was really a big deal when the country was established, to declare war, a very important power of the Congress, to declare war, to raise and finance our armed forces, to establish rules for the armed forces, to call up the state militias, to administer the seat of government or District of Columbia, D.C., to administer federal lands, and to pass laws to implement the above. I'm going to run through those again much more quickly a second time. Think about whether or not some of these powers have been taken away by the executive branch from the legislative branch. And does it seem like it's the president who's doing these things instead of Congress? But here's the powers, again, given in the Constitution to the legislative branch, the Congress, to tax, spend, and borrow, to establish rules for citizenship, to establish bankruptcy laws, to coin and regulate the value of money, to standardize weights and measures, punish counterfeits, set the time, place, and manner of elections, set rules of the legislative bodies, regulate commerce, establish a postal system, post roads, pass copyright and patent laws, establish federal courts, punish crimes on the high seas, declare war, raise and finance armed forces, establish rules for the armed forces, call up state militias, administer the seat of government, meaning D.C., administer federal lands, and pass the laws necessary to implement these things. Again, you probably noticed that some of these have been unconstitutionally taken over by the executive branch. But even with these limited powers, duties, responsibilities that were given to Congress in particular, the federal government more generally, Congress in particular, by the founders in the Constitution, these limited powers, duties, responsibilities were almost immediately checked, clarified, and limited further by the Bill of Rights. So as soon as the Constitution was ratified and became the highest law of the land, the founders recognized that the original draft of the Constitution did not do enough to limit the government and protect the rights of the people. In fact, some of the signers, some of those who represented their respective colonies or states to pass the Constitution, to sign the Constitution and send it on to the states for ratification, they demanded a Bill of Rights in order to sign on the original Constitution. So there was an agreement made during the Constitutional Convention. They would reconvene and work on a Bill of Rights to further protect the people from the federal government, to further protect the states from the federal government. So, of course, they added these specific protections in the Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments to the Constitution, the first 10 amendments. They wanted specific protections for things like freedom of religion, of course, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom in the Second Amendment to keep and bear arms, due process, Fifth Amendment protections not to criminate ourselves, and so forth. And they added the critical 9th and 10th Amendments. I talk a lot about the 9th and 10th Amendments because they have been violated and are violated so regularly and consistently by the federal government today. And most people don't even know about the 9th and 10th Amendments. But the 9th Amendment says, again, part of the Bill of Rights, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So the founders didn't and couldn't list every right that we individuals possess that are given to us by our Creator. So they wanted to make clear that we retain every right and freedom that's not specifically denied to us in the Constitution. Do you feel like the federal government allows you to keep every right and freedom that's not specifically prohibited to you in the Constitution? How about the right to travel, to worship, to make your own decisions on your health care, whether or not you get a vaccine or disclose whether or not you've gotten a vaccine, those sorts of things. The 10th Amendment, which the founders, again, also included in the Bill of Rights, says the powers not delegated by us, by the way, the powers not delegated to the United States, meaning the federal government, by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or the people. So in other words, that the federal government is only to do what the Constitution empowers it to do. The federal government is only to do what the Constitution empowers it to do. Everything else is left to the discretion of the people and the states to decide for themselves, other than violating the Constitution. People in the states cannot violate the Constitution. Local government can't violate the Constitution. But again, the 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated by us to the United States, the federal government, by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Wow, how far today have we gotten away from the 9th and 10th Amendment limits on the federal government? How far have we gotten away from, number one, the legislative branch being the most powerful and accountable branch of government, and number two, the very specific and limited powers of the federal government? If you ask most people on the street, hey, what's the most powerful branch of government? They will say, oh, it's the presidency, it's the executive branch, or it's the Supreme Court, which so often in the past 100 years or so has made laws from the bench. But the founders, again, intended that the legislative branch would be the most powerful branch, and because it was the one that's most accountable to people, and that the federal government generally, and Congress and specifically as well, would have very limited powers. And the reason we have a fiscal crisis and an overly intrusive federal government, and abuse of power by our federal government, is because the federal government is not operating within the constitutional limits on its power as spelled out, again, in the Constitution. Again, the primary purpose of government is to protect the inherent, self-evident, natural, God-given rights of the people. The primary purpose of the federal government is to protect the inherent, self-evident, natural, God-given rights of the people. The founders knew that keeping the republic depended on a moral and religious people, an educated, informed people, and engaged, participating people. The founders knew that keeping the republic depended on a moral and religious people, an educated and informed people, and an engaged, participating people. I would submit once again that we have none of these. So therefore, we, the American people, are the problem, because we're not operating in a moral, religious capacity. We're not educated and informed with respect to our founding documents, our Constitution, our form of government, how our government's operating today, who's doing good, who's doing bad. And we don't have a citizenry that is engaged in participating in our form of government. So that's why we talk so often on this podcast about the Constitution and keeping the republic. It was Benjamin Franklin who is famously to have been quoted to say that when asked after the Constitutional Convention, what kind of a government did you give us? He said, it's a republic if you can keep it. The founders knew that keeping it would be dependent on the people. Again, a moral and religious people, an informed and educated people, an engaged and participating people. The republic will not keep or sustain itself. So we've quoted Ronald Reagan today, and I want to do it once again here. Ronald Reagan said, quote, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. I'm going to read that again. It's a very profound quote by Ronald Reagan. He said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. So we as a moral and religious people, an educated and informed people, and an engaged and participating people must keep our freedom, must keep our republic. That means holding on to our founding Judeo-Christian principles, our values. It was John Adams, the second president, the first vice president, the second president, who said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. So character, values, integrity, morality, and yes, religion, particularly the Christian religion, it matters for the keeping of our republic. So again, it means holding on to our founding Judeo-Christian principles, our values. It means studying and teaching our Constitution, our history, our form of government to our children, to our grandchildren, in our education system. The American people need to understand our Constitution, our history, our form of government. And it means all of us standing up for what we believe, following the example of Charlie Kirk, debating, advocating, supporting the right ideas and the right things, electing or defeating candidates or representatives who do or don't stand for the right things. Again, we've got to be engaged and involved in electing or re-electing candidates and representatives who do the right things, or defeating and not re-electing candidates and representatives who don't do the right things. That is being a moral, informed, engaged citizenry committed to keeping the republic that's been trusted to us, and passing that freedom, that republic, to the next generation and the generations that come after that. So thank you again for joining this episode of the Good for America podcast. I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, refer it to your friends, follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Let's keep the republic.